Alright, movie fans, so with the ongoing writer's strike, there hasn't really been a whole lot of new movie news or movies to review or talk about, so I thought, you know what, for this video, let's choose chaos instead. That's right, we're talking about my biggest movie hot takes, my most controversial movie opinions, the thoughts that make everyone else just go, are you kidding me? And I go, yes. This is the horse that I die on, and yes, that is the phrase I am going with. So we're going to start us off with just generic movie hot takes, then we'll go into some horror stuff, and then we'll round us out with the most contentious opinions out there, comic book movie hot takes. So, you know, it's going to be fun. But before we get into all that, what's your biggest hot takes, your most controversial opinions, the movie thoughts that you think you're the only one to have that, people think you're crazy when you say them out loud, so you say them in very hushed tones in very specific circles. I want to know your hot take opinions first. Let me know down in the comments below. Now, without further ado, we're going to come out swinging right off the bat, because I think the Karate Kid remake, yeah, the one starring Jaden Smith, is better than the original one with Daniel LaRusso, also known as Ralph Macchio. Let's be honest, I like to love all the original Karate Kids except for the Hilary Swank one. I grew up watching the Rocky movies and the Karate Kid movies a lot, so I have a soft spot for all of them. I love Cobra Kai. I just love the world of Karate Kid. That being said, the remake is a lot better in a lot of different ways. I think first and foremost, the main character is a lot better. Jaden Smith is a much more easy to get behind character. I think as a kid, I was like, yeah, Daniel Russo's really got it tough. Everyone keeps bullying him. As an adult, I'm going, he's kind of a little twerp. Like, after a certain point, Cobra Kai totally agrees to leave him alone and not mess with him, yet he keeps egging them on, and he's just a brat. He learns karate just so he can beat up other people, whereas Jaden Smith's character, Dre, literally moves not from New Jersey to California, but from Detroit to China. That's a much bigger adjustment, so I get why he whines and complains for the first half of the movie. He literally got moved to a different continent where they speak a different language and the lifestyle's completely different. Making Dre a younger character, I think, builds more sympathy, because when you're in high school, you need to stand up for yourself. He's getting his butt kicked as a little child, but also, as much as we put Mr. Miyagi on the pedestal of being one of the great all-time movie mentors, and I love Pat Morita's performance, the character of Mr. Miyagi is a bit one note. It's good for what it is, but it's a bit one note. Whereas Mr. Han, played by Jackie Chan, has a lot of interesting layers and tragic depth to him. Yes, Mr. Miyagi had some tragedy in his life of, I went off to war and my girlfriend or wife either died or something along those lines, but he is not directly responsible for said death. Whereas Mr. Han has that tragic line about, I don't remember what we were fighting about, but I hope it was important because it's the last conversation we had, as his road rage is essentially what killed his wife and kid, and he lives with this tragedy and wrecks the cars every single year. He's a much more interesting character, and the relationship is much more symbiotic of Dre needs Mr. Han and Mr. Han needs Dre, as opposed to just straight mentor-mentee relationship. Next up we have, oh boy, another one that I love to rant and rave about. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a great movie that is ruined by a terrible protagonist. Wow. Scott Pilgrim is a scumbag of a human being in that movie. I think the visuals are fantastic. I love the characters. It's honestly one of my favorite Chris Evans roles. I think he's fantastic in it. But Michael Cera's Scott Pilgrim, the problem is this character does not learn. He does not grow. He does not evolve as a person. He is still a scumbag human being that plays off the, girls don't like me. But he has shown repeatedly to like girls, date them, and then be the bad guy in that relationship time and time and time again. The whole premise of the movie is, oh yeah, I'm dating knives, but this different colored hair girl is so much more attractive and I haven't dated her yet. I'm gonna go with her. There's no real actual sense of closure with knives, depending on what version of the movie you're watching. Scott Pilgrim is a bad human being, and I have a hard time getting invested in movies with bad protagonists. Let's bring up Karate Kid again. Scott Pilgrim ruins an otherwise fantastic movie with fantastic visuals and really fun editing choices. I still laugh a lot when it's the whole, is Scott home?
Is Scott here?
You know what? He just left.
Lastly, for our broad movie hot takes, It's one that I still stand by to this day, even though we get further and further away from this decision and it's getting more and more complicated. That is, when Disney bought Lucasfilm, they scrapped all of the Star Wars Expanded Universe. I still to this day maintain that that was absolutely 100% the right move for Disney to make, and here's why. As much as it pains people to hear this, that universe was never canon. You can put it in your weird tiers of canon to begin with. It was never actually 100% canon. The only things that were ever actually canon are the movies and the TV shows that George Lucas approved of. Yes, there's some great stories in there, but for every great story, there is 4 or 5 bad stories that came across as bad Star Wars fan fiction. Have I loved everything that Disney has done since they bought Lucasfilm? No. I think it was 100% the right idea to wipe the slate clean, start over, then you are responsible for the stories that you tell after that. It makes for a much more cohesive universe. You're not confusing your own timeline by having things that clearly can't line up because there wasn't one overriding person controlling this universe. I think getting rid of the expanded universe and then slowly but surely reintroducing the elements that you want is a good idea. We're seeing Thrawn come back. That's a good idea. Reuse elements, but get rid of the crap. Then there's everything else that they did. I'm not defending that. And moving on to horror, one of my favorite subgenres in the movie community. I think The Exorcist 3 is leaps and bounds better than the original Exorcist. I think the original Exorcist is so incredibly dull and not very scary. I think it's one of those it might have been scary for its time, but like another movie that I'll talk about next, I don't think has necessarily withstood the test of time in terms of the scare factor, and it's just not that engaging to me. I've never really connected with the original Exorcist. Then someone came along and said, you gotta watch Exorcist 3. It was written and directed by William Peter Blatty, and guys, I freaking love Exorcist 3 so much. It is not the original Exorcist at all. It is like clearly directed by a writer, as you just have long scenes of characters talking to each other, but it is written so well and so sharply that I'm hanging on every single word, and there's not a ton of blood and violence at all, except for, the world's greatest jump scare of all time. It's just really well written dialogue and really well acted throughout the entire thing. It's probably one of Brad Dourif's best performances as the Gemini. He is fantastic. Exorcist 3. Oh baby, not nearly enough people have seen that, and I always sound crazy when I say Exorcist 3 is fantastic, but not as crazy as when I say to people, I hate The Shining. The original Shining is so freaking boring. I cannot stand it. I do not get how this is considered one of the greatest horror movies of all time, and I'm sure I'm in the minority. Again, this is why it's hot take. I think Stephen King's 100% right that Stanley Kubrick missed the point of the story of you cannot have a story of a man who has been isolated and slowly goes insane, a story that, hits a little too close to home for a lot of us after a certain year recently. It doesn't really connect when that character already comes across as a little crazy and insane from the get-go. There is no descent into madness. There is just madness from the get-go. People will be like, oh, it oozes tension throughout. It is so dry and so incredibly dull for me. And I know people are like, you just don't like old horror. My favorite horror movies of all time is the original Halloween, and before that, 1933's Invisible Man. I like older horror. I just think The Shining is so far up its own butt of, oh, it's Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece. It's not that good, people. It's so dull. I don't understand it. I would much rather watch Mike Flanagan's Dr. Sleep. I think that does a much better job of bridging the gap, not just as a sequel to the movie, the original Shining, but as a sequel to the book. I think Dr. Sleep just succeeds so much better than the original Shining. Lastly, when it comes to horror, I think that the Universal Dark Universe that they tried launching in 2017 with The Mummy was a fantastic idea that they 100% picked the wrong people to be in charge of it. So The Mummy, more or less, was kind of co-written and co-directed by Tom Cruise, if you want to believe some of the reports. I think the big problem and the big fingers that you can point at are the writers of Roberto Orci and Alex Kurtzman, who I think more or less have kind of single-handedly created a monopoly with Star Trek of... whatever you think of the current era of Star Trek, look at those guys. But these are the guys that also wrote Transformers, Revenge of the Fallen, Star Trek Into Darkness, which I actually kind of like, by the way. But more importantly, Amazing Spider-Man 2, which I still maintain is the worst Spider-Man by a wide margin because it was trying to set up way too many other stories. It failed to tell a good one at the core of it, which is exactly what happened a year later with The Mummy. It just wasn't good. That being said, a new version of the Universal Monsters shared universe. Granted, there wasn't a ton of overlap in those early days until you got like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein with some crossover there. I think there's a lot of potential there with having a Van Helsing type character be the one to connect everything together. The problem is you just picked the wrong people to shepherd it. You need a good head of your studio or a good head of the project and a clear vision as to where you're going in order to make this work. But the Universal Monsters, I have always maintained, should be a shared cinematic universe. Now, bringing up the rear is the topic of conversation that, people all across the board have many different opinions. That is the world of comic book movies. First off, I think that the single most underrated movie in the entire MCU is Kenneth Branagh's Thor, the first Thor movie. I don't know why it became such a popular trend to make fun of the first two Thor movies. People are like, we didn't get a good Thor movie till Ragnarok. And I'm going, guys, the first one's really good. It's not like the best MCU movie. It's not a top 10, but it's a lot better than we give it credit for. It's not even in the same ballpark as The Dark World. The first Thor had a very difficult task of establishing a character in Thor that, you had to draw on casual audiences. Here's the God of Thunder in the same universe as a guy that builds iron suits and a guy that we'll introduce in the next movie that basically has a giant frisbee and he's on steroids. But we have to show in a way and visually show that these characters can exist all in the same universe and make it kind of feel that way. Minus too many Dutch angles from Kenneth Branagh as a director, I think Thor pulls off the impossible of, okay, I can actually buy this existing in the same universe as that first Iron Man movie that we saw. It's a good, solid movie. It doesn't reinvent the wheel by any stretch of the imagination, but it didn't have to. Thor 1 is a good, solid movie. Sticking within the MCU, the first half of this probably isn't a hot take, but the second half of it sure might be. And that is, I think after Avengers Secret Wars, whenever that ends up coming out with all these writer strikes and whatnot, I think the MCU should do a reboot after Secret Wars. And I know that's kind of been discussed already, but my hot take version of it is, I think every character should be fair game. I'm not saying everyone should be recast, like some of the newer characters, like Shang-Chi or Kate Bishop, some of the newer characters to the MCU, keep them. But Iron Man, Captain America, Hulk, you can and should recast them. And I know people will be like, but Chris Evans was perfect as Captain America. Robert Downey Jr. was perfect as Iron Man. And I would agree, but at the same time, we have had how many different versions of Batman through the years? Not all of them have been perfect, but people still to this day debate, are you a Keaton person? Are you a Batfleck person? Are you a Pattinson person? Are you a Bale person? There's been multiple Batmans. We can have multiple versions. No role is so synonymous with one person that it cannot be recast, in my opinion, especially with comic book movies. For the life and the longevity of a project, you have to be willing to at least consider the option of a recast. It is not the end of the world. James Bond has been recast how many times? And there's precedent for it. You have writers that take over for a comic book. You have different directors that come in for stories. How is it different for an actor to want to move on to different things, but you still want to use the character? I don't think it's too much to ask of if we're rebooting everything. Again, that's the big what if you will. Another one that I'm sure in no way, shape, or form is this gonna spark an interesting discussion, to say the least. I think there's too much comic book and superhero material targeted specifically for adults and adults only. As much as like the Harley Quinn animated series is perfect, I'm not saying that should go away. I think we need more comic book and superhero elements and TV shows and movies targeted specifically for kids. I know people bag on Teen Titans Go all the time because that's not the Teen Titans I grew up with. Exactly. You grew up, and that's okay. Don't expect things that you grew up with to grow up with you. There still needs to be things for kids and teenagers to watch that get them into things. It makes them excited about something. If we are not fostering the next generation of fandom, we will be the dying generation of fandom. We need to pass on that love and appreciation to the next generation and not judge them because they don't want to watch what we want to watch. The Boys is made for adults. That is totally fine. But at the same time, we need more things for kids. I think we've kind of gotten away from it. Back in the 90s and 2000s, we had the Batman the animated series, Superman the animated series, Static Shock, X-Men, Spider-Man, all these great kids shows that for a little bit made their presence a little bit in the mid to late 2000s with Beware the Batman or Green Lantern, Beware My Power. But those shows have kind of fallen by the wayside. By and large, we've kind of gotten away from that. There's not as many shows for kids nowadays because there's more money to be made in adults and older generations who will make and buy the things that they really want because they grew up with it. But the thing is, those people were allowed to grow up with things. If the next generation's not allowed to also grow up with things, you're going to have a JCPenney situation if your clientele literally dies off. You need to foster the next generation. You don't have to cut back on adult content that's superhero stuff. Just make more for kids. It's not the end of the world. I always say with superhero content, not everything has to be made for me, and that's a good thing. And last but not least, my spiciest hot take. The first half of this is very tame, and the second half is... I'm sure there's going to be some interesting discussion with this. Brandon Routh is a Superman that we had at one point. We had him in Superman Returns, and I still to this day maintain that Brandon Routh is the single most underrated casting in any comic book movie. I think for him trying to be an adaptation of the Christopher Reeve Superman, he is perfect. That movie is not very good. The first half is okay, but the second half is incredibly dull. Brandon Routh is a picture-perfect Superman for what that story was going for, and I think he's the single most underrated comic book casting of all time. He's the most underrated Superman of all time. And here's the hot take. He's not the best live-action Superman of all time. The best live-action Superman of all time is Superman and Lois's Tyler Hoechlin. Holy crap, guys. I am saying this as a die-hard Henry Cavill fan. I still vividly recall seeing Man of Steel at midnight with my dad as one of my favorite theater-going experiences of all time. The thing is, Tyler Hoechlin's Superman has been allowed 3 seasons of story development and growth. I'm basing it off of time spent in the role and what I have actually been allowed to see. There was so much untapped potential with Henry Cavill that I didn't think he was actually get to fulfill on because the studio screwed him around so much. Henry Cavill is still that perfect, ripped out of a comic book look if you're going purely from aesthetics. But when you come to the acting and the writing that's been given and afforded to this character, Tyler Hoechlin's Superman is unrivaled. He has the kindness and the generosity of Christopher Reeves, of just a good-natured heart. Has the action scenes of Henry Cavill's Superman. Granted, he's not as big as Henry Cavill, but that's because no one's as big as Henry Cavill. I know a lot of people sleep on Superman and Lois because it had the whole, it was on CW, and everyone kind of assumes it's like The Flash or Arrow. It is not. It is closer to an HBO Max show because I believe they're the ones funding the show. The show is honestly one of the best incarnations of Superman. I was not sure I was interested in the idea of Superman and Lois being a parent of 2 high school boys, that and all that drama. I was going, this is actually incredibly well written. Their portrayal of Superman, they clearly have done their research. They are huge fans of the material. And it's these little intimate moments, both of him as Clark and him as Superman, that I'm going, these are the moments that I never knew that I was missing. Not to slight Henry Cavill or any other version of Superman, but there's moments that I'm going, that.
Well, don't assume that just because I'm speaking English.
You speak multiple languages. Is that also a superpower?
No, just curiosity about the world. I wanted to know more about different people, different regions, so I studied their languages.
How many languages?
All of them.
That's the goodness that this character is supposed to embody. This is the wholesomeness. He's the friend that Christopher Reeve talked about Superman needing to be. When someone asks Christopher Reeve, what is Superman? He's a friend. That is what Tyler Hoechlin's Superman is. I think he's so perfect, and I'm glad we're getting one more season. And I'm very curious to see what David Cornsweet is going to be in the role. I think James Gunn is going to deliver a fantastic Superman movie. Again, I love Henry Cavill's Superman, but he was not given the spotlight. And I think not enough people are paying attention to Tyler Hoechlin, or they stick their head in the sand because he's not Henry Cavill. But y'all, watch Superman and Lois. That is one of, if not the greatest versions of Superman I have ever seen, and I will never back down from that opinion. Well, what do you guys think? What are some of your biggest movie and entertainment or TV show hot takes? I'm always curious to hear your thoughts on things. I always like to see the chaos ensue. Whatever your thoughts, let me know down in the comments below. And if you like what you see and you want to see more, subscribe to the channel. And as always, stay sharp, movie guys and gals.